Hi, I hope everyone's doing well. I'm hoping that in this video I can squeeze together everything I want to say about Hellenistic history and art. As I said or indicated in the previous video, this week now that we've read Aristotle, we are shifting to a new phase of Greek history, Hellenistic meaning Greek-like. And we go all the way back to the question that I posed several weeks ago, which is why do we spend all this time, weeks and weeks and weeks, on the Greeks? And I talked about all the things the Greeks have given Western culture. But it's only at this juncture in the course that we find out how all of these things, democracy, theater, philosophy, how they spread beyond the Greek world and became part of the common heritage of Western culture. So the history that you're going to be reading about in West in the World this week will help to answer those questions. Just to be perfectly clear, when we talk about the Hellenistic period, we're talking about a period from, let's say, 336 BCE. This is the year that Alexander becomes king of Macedonia, to something like 30 BCE. So we're still before the Common Era, but only just. All right, so when we talk about the Hellenistic period, we have to talk about what's going on in Macedonia, what's going on in that region just to the north of Greece. So I would advise you to go ahead and open up your West in the World book, turn to page 67, and locate Macedonia. Again, just to the north of Greece. Now, the Greeks, people who lived in places like Corinth and Athens and Thebes, they tended to look at Macedonians as not really quite Greek. And Greeks thought that everybody who wasn't Greek was a barbarian, basically. There were some reasons why, let's say, an Athenian might not look at the Macedonians as being actually Greek. Macedonian culture was very different in many ways. It was a culture in which polygamy was still the norm. It was a largely rural culture, in contrast to the more urbanized culture of Greece. There was nothing comparable, culturally speaking, to the great golden age of Athens in the 5th century going on in Macedonia. So Macedonians just didn't have the same kind of cultural cachet. But from the point of view of the Macedonians themselves, at least some of them, many of them, thought of themselves as basically Greek. And they had some good reasons to think that way. Foremost among them, the fact that the Macedonians spoke a dialect of the Greek language. So I think in many ways the Macedonians have the best part of the argument here, even though there's a definite difference between Macedonian and Greek cultures. Well, one of the Macedonians who did see himself as Greek was Philip II. And this is sort of where our survey of Macedonian and Hellenistic history begins. He became king of Macedonia in 359, ruled to his death, his rather mysterious assassination in 336. Great admirer of Greek culture. Already mentioned the fact that Aristotle served as his son Alexander's tutor. So he wanted his son to have a real Greek tutor. Philip was extremely ambitious in many ways. He wanted to unify the Macedonians, who had not really been terribly unified up to this point. He wanted to expand the army to make it more sophisticated. So that's something to be looking for as you read. What are some of the main military innovations that Philip introduced? Because what he's going to do is turn the Macedonians into a really formidable army. So how does he do that? Well, he gets to a point where he is ready to actually look to the south at Greece, which was still a mess politically speaking. You've got all these, hundreds of police, and they're often fighting amongst themselves, no real political unity to speak of. And he's able to take advantage of this situation, wins a major victory in Greece in 338, and then, for all intents and purposes, becomes the ruler of Greece. So this is really kind of the beginning of the end of the Greek polis as we have known it so far. The polis no longer are going to have that autonomy and independence that they once enjoyed. But Philip's sights were set on even bigger goals than the conquest of Greece. He wanted to do nothing less than conquer the greatest empire that the world had ever seen, which is the Persian Empire. And part of the reason he wanted to do this was as payback for the great Persian invasion of 490, which was 150 years in the past at this point, but it does show how Philip saw himself as Greek. The Persians attacked us back in 490, and now we are going to get our revenge. So he's clearly thinking of himself as a Greek here. But I already alluded to this, in the spring of 336, under circumstances that have remained mysterious to this day, Philip is assassinated. And his son Alexander becomes king. He's a very young man. He's 20 years old when he becomes king in 336. And he inherits his father's plans for the Persian invasion. He was very much in favor of this idea. And the Persian army is still, perhaps not as great as it was at one point, but still a major force to be reckoned with. So in 334, Alexander is going to take his huge army, about 30,000 infantry, 5,000 cavalry. They're going to cross the Hellespont, that narrow body of water that separates Europe from Asia, and head toward the Persians. So look at page 79 of West in the World. That will show you the route that Alexander took, leaving Macedonia and heading eastward to the Persian Empire. He eventually makes it all the way to the capital of the Persian Empire, which you can see there on the map. The capital was Persepolis. Absolutely razes the city, destroys the city. The Persian king, flees. So the Persian Empire doesn't exist anymore. But as you'll see on that map, Alexander is going to continue to the east. And again, there's debate about what he thought he was doing and why he kept on pushing his troops to go so far to the east, to the point where they were in what is now Pakistan. And he wanted to go further still, but his troops mutiny, so he has to turn tail, head back to the west. And in 323, he's in the city of Babylon, and after a kind of prolonged drinking bout, he contracts an illness to which he succumbs and then dies at the ripe old age of 32. So that's 323. So he has this great meteoric career. He's one of the most successful military generals of all time, but it doesn't last terribly long. So what's going to happen now? In theory, Alexander has put together an empire of mind-boggling proportions, an empire even larger than what the Persians once possessed. So the question at first is going to be, can there be another single individual to step up and hold all this territory together? Well, it turns out no. No one is going to be up to that task. So what happens in the end is that vast amount of territory all the way from Macedonia in the west to India, Pakistan in the east, that's going to be parceled out among some of his most trusted generals. And this process takes about 50 years or so for everything to get sorted out. So what we're left with are the so-called Hellenistic kingdoms. Okay? Most notably, the Ptolemaic kingdom. That's Ptolemaic, starting with a P, Ptolemaic, named after General Ptolemy. That's going to be centered in Egypt. You're also going to have the Seleucid kingdom, Seleucid. The Seleucid kingdom will encompass most of the Asian territories that Alexander conquered. And then finally, closer to home in Greece and Macedonia, you have the Antagonids, Antagonids, Antagonids. All of these dynasties named after generals of Alexander. These are all kingdoms, these are all monarchy. So again, Greek democracy as it once existed in places like Athens and other polis as well is really going to be a pale shadow of its former self. Can't say Greek democracy is entirely dead, but it's not the same anymore. Okay, well, why are these political developments so important? Why are they so significant? Well, it's these political and military developments that make possible the spread and dissemination of Greek culture throughout much of what was then the known world, at least for Europeans. Culture does not spread magically through the air like fairy dust. Culture is transmitted through institutions. And this is true of the Hellenistic period as well. One of the main mechanisms by which Greek culture was exported as far afield as places like modern-day Afghanistan was colonies. Alexander himself founded dozens of Greek colonies as he traveled, most famously in Alexandria, right? Alexandria in Egypt becomes one of the most important cities of the Mediterranean world for the next half millennium or so. So Alexander creates about 70 of these colonies, and then his successors, the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, they will establish yet other colonies. So these are cities, sort of newly established cities, that are usually run by Greek or Macedonian people. So people who have left Greece, left Macedonia, in some cases traveled thousands of miles to become sort of the ruling elite of these colonies. And they would be given some incentive for this. They'd be given farmland and other sorts of political privileges. So what you have are these little pockets, these little islands of Greek culture surrounded by very different kinds of cultures. And these cities, they would be Greek in a number of respects. I mean, not only would the rulers and administrators typically be Greek, but they would establish Greek institutions like the gymnasium. Gymnasium, a really important Greek cultural institution. Yes, as the name suggests, it was an athletic facility, but it was so much more. In the Greek world, gymnasium was a place for socializing. It was a place for education. Gymnasiums would have libraries and lecture halls and things of that nature. So these types of institutions are going to help spread Greek culture to places hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from Greece. Again, Alexandria, I think, is the best example of all. So that's one mechanism by which Greek culture will be spread. Another is through trade, through commerce. So, trade networks are set up connecting Macedonia to Africa, to Central Asia. And so as a result, a form of the Greek language becomes sort of the international language of commerce, sort of like French used to be and English is today. And this form of Greek is called Koine Greek, Koine, Koine. It's a kind of simpler form of Greek, a kind of Greek that's not terribly elaborate. This is the kind of Greek that the New Testament is written in. And that right there, of course, raises a question. Why in the world did the evangelists, those who wrote the Gospels, who were writing about events that took place in Palestine, events that involved people who spoke languages like Aramaic, why are they writing in Greek? I think that shows you that by that time, Greek culture had spread so far and wide that it was not an unusual thing at all for books written in Palestine to be written in the Greek language. So trade helps to spread the Greek language and maybe to a lesser extent Greek ideas as well. All right. So what can we say about Hellenistic society, especially compared to classical Greek society? What is going to change? Well, for one thing, the gap between the rich and poor, which was already an issue in classical Greece, is only going to become worse. So there's a kind of widening gap there. One symptom of this is the fact that there's actually a kind of expansion of slavery at this time. So slavery becomes a kind of omnipresent reality. On the more positive side of things, it would appear that women typically had more freedoms in the Hellenistic world than they did in the classical Greek world. Greater freedom to travel, greater freedom to work in various occupations, and so on. And there are a number of Hellenistic queens who are very important, the most famous of whom certainly is Cleopatra VII, the very last Ptolemaic ruler, often just referred to as Cleopatra, but technically she was the seventh. So we see some really powerful women during the Hellenistic period, in a way that we didn't in classical Greece. Political differences also, and I've already sort of touched on that. Classical world, you have all these polis. They're all basically autonomous and independent. Now, we have these, in the Hellenistic period, we have these vast kingdoms. They are ruled by kings. They are ruled by dynasties. So, families that stay in power for generations. Government then becomes something that is done by professional bureaucrats, which is very different than the kind of Athenian ideal of government as something that ordinary citizens can do, something that is really for amateurs in a very real sense. Not so much anymore. One other sort of social tendency, and again, this I think could be seen as positive, the classical Greeks, as I've already mentioned, were very chauvinistic. They thought Greeks, everything good in the world, the Greeks came up with. And everybody else, if you're not a Greek, you're a barbarian. That attitude becomes much less prevalent during the Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period is much more cosmopolitan. And really that actually can be traced to some extent to Alexander himself, who married foreign women, non-Greek women. He encouraged his generals to do the same. All right. Well, from this point on, I think everything I'm going to say could go under the heading of Hellenistic culture. And as always, that is our paramount concern in this class. We're interested in cultures. So what can we say about Hellenistic culture? Well, I think in a lot of ways, the Hellenistic period is seen as a kind of lesser period than the classical period, a kind of less exciting period. And there's some truth to that, but there's another side of the story too. For instance, if you look at math and science, there's no question the Hellenistic period is much more exciting, much more sophisticated in terms of mathematical and scientific developments than the classical period. So be looking for that as you read. You're going to be reading about advancements in geometry, in astronomy, in medicine, and so on and so forth. So that's one area where Hellenistic culture was really quite vibrant and exciting. Philosophy is another facet of culture, and philosophy continues to be something very popular and influential in Greek culture and Hellenistic culture. But we see the rise of new philosophical schools, and you're going to be reading about some of these. Cynicism, Epicureanism, Stoicism, those are three of the most prominent. They're all very different in many ways, especially something like Stoicism, Epicureanism. In many ways, you could even say maybe they're opposite. But there is a deep commonality, and I think the deep commonality reflects something very important about Hellenistic culture. The commonality is that unlike, say, the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle, these Hellenistic philosophies are very much focused on the individual. Okay? How can the individual achieve something like happiness or contentment? This makes sense because now in the Hellenistic period, people don't have much input into politics. People don't have as much control over the government as they might have in classical Athens. So what do you do then? You focus on what you can control, your own thoughts, your own actions, and so on. So all of these philosophies are going to be sort of individualistic, which is very much characteristic of the Hellenistic period. Now we have to remember that in any age, philosophy is only going to be an option for the elite few. An option that was much more widely accessible during this period were the mystery religions. So we're kind of moving from philosophy into religion now. Now, in many ways, religion stays the same. Okay, so the cities are worshiping the same pagan gods that they were in the classical period. But what we see is the rise of these religions called mystery religions that were meant to be supplements to those traditional civic forms of pagan religion. They get that name, mystery religion, because almost all of these groups had very mysterious, secretive rites of initiation. So if you wanted to join one of these groups, it would be this sort of elaborate initiation rite, and you weren't supposed to tell anybody about it, or you would be banned or whatever. So that's how they get their name. These are cults or religions, we can use those terms synonymously, that are especially devoted to one particular god, often a god who sort of originated outside of Greece. So Isis, who originated in Egypt, or Mithra, who originated in Persia. And the idea is that by joining one of these religions, you would have a particularly close and intimate relationship with that deity. So that's one thing that you're being promised, is a kind of a more personal connection to a god, which you don't really get so much in traditional forms of Greco-Roman, or I should say Greek paganism. Many of these religions also promise something that is not typical of older forms of Greek religion, and that is some kind of happy afterlife, some kind of life beyond the grave. Older Greeks believed there was some kind of life beyond the grave, but nothing to really look forward to. Think back to the Odyssey, Odysseus' trip into Hades, not a place to aspire to go, but a much more positive view of the afterlife emerges. Now, if you think about it, there's one religion that emerges sort of at the tail end of the Hellenistic period that seems to fit the profile of mystery religions quite well, and that is Christianity. Christianity promises a kind of close, intimate connection to God. Of course, the roots of Christianity are in Asia, not in the Greek world. And of course, Christianity promises a happy afterlife. So is Christianity a mystery religion? I think the answer actually is no. It looks like one in many ways, but the thing to remember about mystery religions is that they were meant to supplement the kind of polytheistic forms of worship that were already happening in Hellenistic cities. They were not meant as a replacement. And that is certainly not true of Christianity. Christianity made very absolute sort of demands. You have to reject all other forms of religion. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Christianity in a few weeks. All right, other forms, other sort of avenues of culture, literature. You're going to read about some new trends in literature. In drama, or in theater, I guess I should say, we have this new genre known as the new comedy. Tragedies are no longer so popular. Instead, we get all these plays that are about couples in love trying to overcome great odds and so on. So we see here actually what we saw in philosophy, a real focus on sort of the plight of the individual. Some of the communal concerns that we see in plays like Antigone, we don't see so much in Hellenistic drama. Another form of literature that is more or less invented during this period is the novel. It's not exactly the novel as we know it today, but not entirely different either. These are long narratives written in prose. The plots tend to be pretty similar to the plots of the new comedies. You've got couples in love, overcoming obstacles, and so on. So again, we see a focus on the personal more so than on the political. So that's one development you're going to read about. Finally, there is art, and you have a reading from Art Across Time this week. It's not terribly long. So the question is, how is Hellenistic art going to compare with all of the classical Greek art we've already looked at? Let me just preview some things I think that you will notice if you look at these works closely enough. In classical Greek art, the concern, I think, was more about sort of the universal, what all human beings have in common by virtue of being human. In Hellenistic art, this is going to sound familiar, much more focus on the individual. What makes every individual different? What makes every individual distinct? So again, we see that kind of individualistic thrust that reflects the new political environment of the Hellenistic period, where people don't really participate in politics in the way that they did back in the classical days of the polis. So just as a couple of examples, and here you want to have Art Across Time out, look at the seated boxer. This is on page 177. Whereas in classical Greek art, think about the discus thrower for a moment. You don't get much of a sense of like an individual personality, right? He's sort of representing all great athletes. The seated boxer, in contrast, really sort of looks like a real person, somebody you might walk past on the street. I think you see the same thing in the statue of Demosthenes. Demosthenes was a great Athenian orator. This is on 175 of West in the World. And you really get the sense of a distinctive, unique individual, somebody with an emotional life, somebody real. And that brings me to my next point, which is in classical Greek art, we saw idealism. Right? You portray the human body in its ideal form, young, fit, in control. You don't really show much emotion because that's not ideal. The ideal is that we keep our emotions in check and we are guided by our reason. We are acting rationally. We saw a lot of that in classical Greek sculpture. What you see in Hellenistic art is a very different side of the human condition. People are depicted when they're not at their prime, when they're old, when they're weak, when they're dying, when they're overcome by emotion. Just a couple of examples. I mean, actually, I can give you the same examples. Um, the boxer, who looks, defeated, past his prime. Demosthenes is old, and he's wrinkled, and you can just tell how much worry he has had over the plight of Athens. So we see realism rather than the idealism of the classical period. To pick up on a point I made a moment ago, we also see emotional display rather than emotional restraint. So check out the sculpture of Laocoon on page 178. In some ways, it has that classical idealism. He's very fit, his anatomy is perfect. But if you look at his face, he's grimacing, he's in pain, he's losing control, not gaining control. Very different from the classical works that we looked at. Or look at the frieze from the altar of Zeus on page 179. There's this sort of frenzy, and the faces display raw emotion in a form we never saw in classical art. Real quickly, two other differences where classical art sort of preferred to show people at rest. People are poised, composed, in control. Hellenistic artists like to sort of create the illusion of movement, of dynamism. Great example of this is a very famous work of art, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, Art Across Time, page 176. You get the sense that this figure is, just sort of in the process of landing. If you compare that to, say, the Critias boy from the classical age, I think the difference is pretty stark. And finally, in the realm of architecture, I haven't said much about architecture, don't need to say much about architecture, but whereas in classical architecture, the focus was more on sort of the functional structure. So think about the Parthenon and all those pillars that go around it. Well, those pillars are playing an important functional role. They are sort of, keeping the building standing. In Hellenistic architecture, there's an emphasis on sort of decoration over function. So if you look at the altar of Zeus on page 179, you have all those columns, but the columns are not serving any kind of functional purpose. They are there as eye candy. They're there as decoration. So we're going to see some parallels. There's going to be some continuities between classical and Hellenistic art, but you'll see some decided discontinuities as well. All right, I'm done.